on the escalation of violence between Israel and Palestine. And I would like to give the floor once again to Mr. Della Vedova.
Grazie, signora Presidente.
Thank you, Madam President. Ladies and gentlemen, on the 8th of July, Israel launched the Operation Protective Edge in the Gaza Strip. The Israeli reaction followed the intensification of rocket launches from Gaza, which in turn were triggered in reaction to the Israeli Operation Brother's Keeper, which was intended to find the murderers of the 3 Israeli adolescents, teenagers, kidnapped the previous week. Operation Protective Edge has already caused the death of more than 202 Palestinians, most of them innocent civilians, and more than 1,400 wounded, victims of the hundreds of air raids and bombings and bombardments from Israel of the Gaza Strip, and the launching of hundreds of rockets from Gaza towards Israel. Thousands of Gazan residents have been forced to flee, and more than 40,000 soldiers of the Israeli land forces have been mobilized along the border between Israel and Gaza. The humanitarian situation in Gaza was already very serious before these last hostilities, and it's getting worse by the hour. The United Nations has launched an appeal for a humanitarian pause in the conflict in order to allow the population to supply themselves. The European Union and all main leaders in the international community, including the United States and the United Nations, have spoken to deplore this escalation of violence. The European Union has expressed extreme concern at the rapid deterioration in the situation and firmly condemned the indiscriminate launching of rockets towards Israel by militant groups in the Gaza Strip. The Union deplores the growing number of civilian victims coming from the Israeli operation and stresses the fundamental importance of security and safety for all civilians, Palestinians and Israelis. We firmly invite all parties to show the greatest moderation in order to avoid further victims and re-establish calm. We urge bordering countries to work with every form of commitment towards an immediate cessation of hostilities. Hamas has not accepted the Egyptian proposal of a ceasefire, but if there is any possibility of an agreement on a truce, that opportunity should not be wasted. The High Representative Vice President Cathy Ashton is in permanent contact from Vienna, where she's running the delicate negotiations on Iranian nuclear matters. Is encouraging the parties towards a ceasefire. The Italian Foreign Minister and the German Foreign Ministers are on the ground between Israel and Palestine just these days. In many contacts with the Secretary of State, John Kerry, and his European counterparts, Lady Ashton has tried to ensure that the international community, with the European Union in the lead, can meet the immediate needs of the people of Gaza. It's extremely worrying, this situation, and we continue to think that substantive peace negotiations are necessary, and direct ones, between Israel and Palestine in order to find a lasting solution to the conflict. We must put an end to all claims and take account of the legitimate concern of Israel in security and also of the situation of Gaza. As part of this process, which we hope will resume shortly, it will be important not to lose sight of the fundamental issues and the factors at the underlying the recent failure of peace discussions that the United States supported, as well as underlying the recent wave of violence. Let's call things by their name. The lack of will for the difficult choices which is necessary to make peace is the reason why the last cycle of negotiations failed, and that in turn created a vacuum which is now being filled by the violence that we're seeing. As if that was not enough, recent events coinciding with dangerous developments in the whole Middle East that we were just talking about. And they represent serious threats both for the European Union and for its partners and direct neighbors in the region. The Union is convinced that the deterioration in the regional context makes it more necessary than ever that there be a solution to the conflict based on two states coexisting. We think that the only way to remove violence and solve the conflict is an agreement putting an end to the occupation that began in 1967 and an agreement that corresponds to meets the aspirations of both parties. A single state reality today would be incompatible with those aspirations. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, it's necessary to convince the leaders of Israel and Palestine to take bold and decisions which are necessary to put an end to the present spiral of violence and to resume negotiations. You may be sure that the Union will do everything it can to contribute to meeting this objective. Thank you for your attention.
Merci, monsieur. Je pense qu'on peut demander au...
Thank you. We can ask the GUI representatives to take their seats now. Mr. Van Orden has the floor now.
Madam Chairman, in the House of Commons in London, the Speaker of the House has no hesitation to interrupt the Prime Minister on a point of order or when he wants to call order in the House. I see no reason whatsoever why you shouldn't interrupt the Council when they're speaking, when you have a blatant disregard for the dignity of this House, with people standing up making demonstrations of this nature, and it should be stopped. And I think there's something that's particularly absurd about a group of communists complaining about occupation and military aggression in any context.
Merci, monsieur. Il ne m'a pas semblé que l'ordre avait été perturbé.
Thank you. I did not consider that the order in the House had been disturbed by this action. We can now continue with the procedure. Mr. Preda has the floor.
Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. As you know, our group had some reticence when it came to the adopting of a resolution today to accompany the debate we are holding today. It seems very difficult to come up with a succinct and clear text that all groups can subscribe to. What we have now is a single text, even though the EPP, ECR and ALDE groups will support the common text. Having participated in the negotiations, I can say that there is a broad agreement on the core ideas when it comes to the reaction to the escalation of violence in Israel and Palestine. For the EPP, it's important that we emphasize the fact that we focus on the causes of the crisis, the current crisis, the abduction of 3 young Israelis on the 12th of in July, followed by the abduction of a young Palestinian some days later. We can only condemn these abhorrent acts and express our commiserations to the families. We very much regret the escalation of violence that has followed, and we call on the immediate end of this violence. This means that Hamas needs to stop firing rockets from the Gaza Strip into and we've said on several occasions in the past that Israel has a right to defend itself in the wake of indiscriminate attacks. All people must respect international humanitarian law. The answer to this crisis is clearly not more violence, and we support all diplomatic solutions leading to a de-escalation of the crisis and to a ceasefire. The initiative presented by the Egyptians on the 14th of July to be welcomed and represented a step in the right direction. We now need to insist on Hamas putting an end to violence. Finally, despite our differences, A common objective brings us together. That is the objective of establishing peace and security for Israelis and Palestinians. We want there to be a negotiated solution on a two-state basis. Credible efforts need to be made on both sides with the support of the European Union so that we can relaunch negotiations and move towards a lasting peace in the Middle East. Thank you. Thank you very much for respecting your speaking time, even though the clock wasn't set. Mr. Boștinaru now has the floor on behalf of the Socialists and Democrats for 2.5 minutes.
Madame la Présidente, je veux saluer la contribution de la...
Well, I would like to welcome the contribution from Council. And I would ask you to if I can continue in English.
I reiterate today the serious concern of my group about the new escalating violence between Israel and Hamas and the rising number of Palestinian and Israeli civilians dead, wounded, and the huge logistics which have been destroyed due to the attacks. Yes, we strongly call for avoiding all further targeting of civilian population and an immediate ceasefire followed by negotiations. The death of children and innocents are simply unacceptable for each and every of us. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency is informing that 55 installations have been damaged since 1st June 2014. In the past 24 hours only, 6 UNRWA installations were damaged, 5 schools in Rafah, South Gaza Strip, and 1 health center in the middle area of Gaza. In this incredible context, today probably the rockets are still targeting in an indiscriminate manner Israel, and airstrikes are continuing to hit different locations in the Gaza Strip. And the main and the most devastating question is how can this round of violation could or should be stopped? And I believe that this war is not serving neither to Israeli nor to the Palestinians, but it can serve to Hamas groups and all other radicals which are fighting for recovering their full influence over the Gaza Strip. I also believe in the Israeli government's sincere will for de-escalation and ceasefire, for starting the negotiation for peace, as they have shown yesterday by accepting the ceasefire proposed by Egypt. The region is extremely unstable today and confronted with serious unrest. The crisis between Israel and Gaza is the last we need and the most dangerous, which can inflame the whole region in a dramatic context. The repercussions on the Palestinian territories and in southern Jerusalem, but also in the neighboring countries, are of serious concern. This is why our role, our European Union's role, is in mediating and calming the tension, and this should be constant and strong. Unrest in the Middle East lasted for too long, and it is the time, I'm concluding right now,
your time is
thank
over.
you,
Please
immediately, but the European voice is still too shy and still too ineffective.
Sorry, I have to cut you off. You have to come to the end. I'm sorry, Mr. Boștinaru. Mr. Boștinaru, that the time is over. Thank you. I have two blue cards. Would you want to answer, Mr. Boștinaru? One is from Ms. Molly Scott-Cato. The floor is yours.
Very much. I share Mr. Boștinaru's horror about the increasing levels of violence in Israel and Palestine, but I'm aware of the fact that during the negotiations over which resolution was going to be taken tomorrow, he was not prepared to support a much stronger green resolution, which specifically identified the failings of the quartet process and the failings of its envoy, Tony Blair. Can I ask Mr. Boștinaru whether he thinks the quartet process is working well, and does he think that Tony Blair is a successful and effective peace envoy?
The answer is evident. It's not functioning well because the peace is missing. And this is why I reiterate the need of the European Union to be an effective, visible and consistent contributor to the peace process and not to assist the process which is done by others. It's our fundamental role to be broker of this imperative of our nowadays, to be a broker of peace in the Middle East.
There was another blue card by Margrete AUKEN. Are you willing to take it? Mr. Boştinaru, another blue card by Margrete AUKEN. You willing to take it? Margrete AUKEN.
Mrs. President, just ask Victor, why are there none of the figures in your resolution? Why don't you mention the immense amounts of civilians killed on the Gaza side, with, with 1/3 at least children? Is it because you don't think that there's an imbalance here? Do you think it's equal partners? To me, it's very cynical not having these figures in the resolution. You didn't accept them from our resolution, and I think it's important to show that we are not dealing with equal partners in a war here. We are dealing with an enormously strong occupying military power and a besieged civil population.
Okay. Mr. Boştinaru.
Yes. Madam Auken, a resolution is good if can get a majority and it's adoptable. And to be adopted, we need a majority. This is why we negotiated, and this is why the 4 largest political groups in this House have joined their effort in a well-balanced, moderated and contributing not to inflame but to de-escalate the tension, and this is the purpose of our common work. And I welcome very much the possibility that the 4 major political groups succeeded to back a resolution which is to be adopted tomorrow. This is why I welcome very much the contribution of all groups, including the 4 I mentioned before. Thank you.
Okay, the next speaker on our list is Mr. Bas BELDER from the European Conservatives and Reformists Group.
Ja, dank u wel, mevrouw de voorzitter. Veel succes in uw...
Thank you, Madam President. Allow me to wish you success in your position. Last Sunday, I read a very interesting report on the escalation of violence between Hamas and Israel, and I cite, Hamas acts independently and it does not hesitate to use the people of Gaza as human shields. So, to put it succinctly, Hamas is using its own citizens, Palestinian citizens, in the Gaza Strip as shields. So it's no coincidence that Hamas is on the EU list of terrorist organizations. Hamas currently has some 6,000 to 7,000 rockets in its arsenal, which brings me to my conclusion. Who supplied this organization with rockets? And the answer is very simple: Iran. Only a short while ago, the High Representative sat down at a table with the Iranian leadership. Without the support of Iran, the threat from Hamas and Hezbollah against Israel would not be possible. How much horror do we have to witness before we put an end to this? Let's not talk even about the possibility of a nuclear Iran. We simply cannot believe the claims that the nuclear program in Iran is for civil ends only. This is why I call on Council to not give any ground in talks on the nuclear talks with Iran.
Next speaker is Mr. Ivo VAJGL from the ALDE Group for 2 minutes. The floor is yours.
Spoštovana.
Honorable Chair, Honorable Ulrike, congratulations for your new post. In Gaza and in Israel, innocent civilians are dying again. There are people dying that may believe that their death will benefit a cause, but it may well benefit the cause of the other side. We have put together a resolution that we hope both the Israeli and the Palestinian side will view as correct, well-intentioned and balanced. We want to make a contribution to the resolution of this conflict that is not only a burden on the two nations involved, but is something that has much broader dimensions. In this very same region, there are a number of wars taking place. We are witness to a humanitarian disaster. It is clear that the European Union and the European Parliament cannot remain silent when it comes to the events in Israel and Gaza. We need to condemn all the crimes that have taken place. The murder of the Israeli adolescents that has led to further events. The murder of the young Palestinian is just as serious a crime. And all these events are disrupting any belief in lasting peace. We cannot continue in this cycle of rising tensions and aggressive events. The peace process is at a dead end. It has been for years. This is a situation that is going nowhere when it comes to the lasting solution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We need two states recognizing one another and cohabitating in peace. Neither the rocket fire nor the occupation of the West Bank are acceptable when it comes to finding peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivo VAJGL, also for your congratulations to me, because this is the premiere also for me sitting up here on the Presidium. So, thank you. And the next speaker is Ms. Martina Andersson from the Group of European United Left, Nordic Green Left.
Gaza is once again a crisis point. Millions worldwide are protesting against the slaughter taking place there. Unfortunately, the joint resolution is a woeful attempt to address the reality of the current conflict. It neutralises the onslaught to avoid criticising Israel. The EPP and S&D cosy consensus is disgraceful. Over 200 Palestinians are dead. 1,250 have been injured. 17,000 have sought refuge. 1,300 buildings, including hospitals, homes and schools, have been destroyed by Israeli bombs, and it continues. This is an appalling carnage. Attacks from both sides should stop. The causes of the conflict are ignored in the joint sham resolution. Israel's collective punishment on Palestinians in the aftermath of the murder of 3 young Israeli boys, which we all deplore, is not mentioned. The arrests of hundreds of Palestinians, which contributed towards tension in the region, is not mentioned. Israel's violation of international humanitarian law, with expansion of settlements and the construction of apartheid walls and roads, are not mentioned. Israel must end, and we must end the impunity over such gross violations. Israel must lift the blockade on Gaza and stop the slaughter. This Parliament must show it cares, and it would fit the MEP who complained about us standing along with millions worldwide who are protesting to also show that he cares.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Anderson. There are 2 blue cards for you. Are you willing to take them? The first one was Mr. Tannock.
Mrs. Anderson, you're a well-known apologist for Hamas, but would you accept that Israel has the right to defend itself militarily against rocket attacks, even by military means if necessary? And would you also accept that Hamas and Islamic Jihad are in fact committing international war crimes by hiding their weapons and launching their missiles from civilian areas, including mosques and hospitals and schools?
Ms. Anderson?
Well, the corollary of what you're saying must be that you would say that Israel, and you would agree, that when Israel is attacking Gaza, that Gaza has a right to respond. Let's be clear about this. Israel violates international human rights and humanitarian law. The UN Charter is also violated. It also does not deal with the Fourth Geneva Convention. There are a list, and it's endless, where they have been criticised for their abuses and their violation of international and humanitarian law. And I would say that the millions of people who are standing in protest with concern about what's happening in Israel, that is what's happening in Palestine and Gaza, you should be more concerned about that.
Thank you. There has been two other blue cards, but I'll take the one from another political group, from the other side of the House, Mr. LIBERADZKI. If you're willing to take it, Ms. Anderson.
Thank you, Chairman. Question to Ms. Anderson. Is there a need for a resolution, do you think? Are you aware of the fact that if we push our expectations may actually lead to abandoning this resolution altogether? Can you give us three advantages of your resolutions project, please?
Ms. Anderson, and I ask you to keep to the 30 seconds, please.
Okay. I was in the negotiation yesterday, and I have to say the EPP and the S&D did not even try to negotiate with those of us who wanted a stronger resolution. The cosy consensus in this Parliament between the EPP and the S&D is not what the voters voted for. And I think that it is absolutely disgraceful how those negotiations were conducted yesterday, and I can tell you as someone who was sitting there that the views of the millions who are protesting were totally disregarded.
We continue with the speakers list. I have two other blue cards, but I will not take them now. There will be other moments where you can use your blue cards. The debate is still going on. The next speaker on the list is Mr. Tamás MESZERICS for 2 minutes and 30 seconds.
Thank you, President. It is certainly not easy to formulate a statement on the tragic situation in Gaza, which is simultaneously meaningful, actually helpful to the victims and the vulnerable populations, and hopefully may have an impact on the entire crisis. As a first-time member, I came here with a certain level of idealism, not unlike many of you, I presume, anyway. Idealism in the sense of believing that benevolent intentions and political wisdom may be able to produce exactly such statement and such type of a resolution and such actions resulting from these statements. I'm afraid the joint resolution is not such a text, and I regret to say that. I was also there at the negotiations yesterday. I may be a bit of an idealist, but at the same time I'm not naive. I know that in cases of escalating violence, you'd better tread very, very lightly in order not to exacerbate the situation. That is true. But in this case, walking on tiptoes resulted in an empty resolution text. This is the considered view of me and the group simultaneously. I don't call into the question the motives of the major parties. In trying to write a brief text focusing on de-escalation and trying to balance and to make the possibilities of de-escalation at least meaningful, but the excessive pruning eliminated actually almost all content. We regret to say that we cannot vote for an empty shell of a resolution. First of all, the text fails to mention almost anything related to the EU. Whenever the EU appears in the text, it appears tangentially. If we agree that the EU should play an influential role in the region and in all its adjacent regions, and this text gets dangerously close to an abdication of responsibility. We tried to rectify that with a resolution, with an amendment that we tabled to paragraph 6. Secondly, the text fails to mention a number of facts that my colleague already listed. These facts are inconvenient, I know, but I'm sure I speak in the name of my group and myself simultaneously when I say I consider myself a friend of Israel. But I'm also a friend of Palestine, and it's a duty of friends to call the attention to inconvenient facts as well. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker on the list is Mr. Fabio Massimo Castaldo. The floor is yours for 3 minutes.
Signor Presidente, onorevoli
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, we in the Five Star Movement are not here blindly to support a particular movement or to put a particular label on our support. We only favor two peoples, the Palestinian and the Israeli, who are both calling for the right to exist and a reasonable life for their children. We are in favor of innocent civilians, the weakest, who often just are to blame in the sense that they've inherited a difficult history. They are just unlucky. They crossed the wrong road at the wrong time. And we stand against those people who committed the atrocious crime of killing those 3 children, and we want justice, not vendettas continuing. An eye for an eye gets everyone ultimately blind. That's what Mahatma Gandhi said. While we're speaking, there's still bombardments from one side and rockets launched from the other. Whole families are paying for despair. The disproportion of the forces on the ground is clear. More than 200 people killed, more than 1,400 injured, including women, handicapped people, children shot because they were playing football. Some bombs are supposed to be smart, but they're certainly not merciful. The Gaza Strip has been abandoned to itself, and merely 2 million people are at risk of a humanitarian catastrophe. The inhabitants are depending almost entirely on UN for food and medicine. The refugees are running away without anywhere that they can go because the tunnels to Egypt only work for the most serious injuries. The Mediterranean, the sea around my country, is, people seem to think, enough to separate us from this. But if the Union wants to be a serious actor on the world stage, then this is the opportunity to show that with a single voice it can live up to its ambitions, because the Mediterranean is not the ditch around a medieval castle. It's a means of transport, and it always has been for millennia. We need to stand out against extremisms, because the only kind of extremism we can accept is the extremism for dialogue at all costs, peace based on equal rights and equal dignity, to find an agreement between the parties on the basis of an Egyptian proposal for a lasting truce, a peace between two free, independent peoples who will at last be able to live together in harmony. Those should be our two objectives as a parliament, with the duty to show European democracy, to support European democracy in Europe. This is what millions of people around the world are expecting from us. Let us hope that for once we can abandon raison d'etat and can accept instead a state of reason.
Mr. Castaldo, there is a blue card for you. Are you willing to take it from Mr. Iglesias? Mr. Iglesias, for 30 seconds.
Gracias, Presidenta. Señor Castaldo, bien sabe.
Thank you, President. Mr. Castaldo, as you know, I share some of your views, but even despite the good intentions of your words, can you not see that there is a blatant situation of injustice of Israel vis-à-vis the weaker party, the Palestinians?
Grazie, collega Iglesias.
Thank you, Mr. Iglesias. What I can say, and what I think I said a number of times in my speech, is that I think there is definitely a disproportion. defense to be legitimate has to be proportional, and we are afraid that at the moment that proportion has been lost. But we hope that as soon as possible the parties will return to the negotiating table on the basis of the 67 borders and mutual recognition of the states and of the communities.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Marcel de GRAAFF for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mrs. President. Ik ga verder in het Nederlands. Afgelopen week hebben de inwoners van Israël.
Last week, the inhabitants of Israel lived in dreadful anxiety because of the attacks of Hamas. This terrorist association only has one objective: to destroy all the Jews in Israel. And we have to put an end to this violence immediately. Israel accepted the ceasefire proposal from Egypt, but Hamas rejected it to be able to continue its terrorist attacks. So these are murderers, terrorists who don't listen to reason. We have to put an end to this escalation, to this terror. So while Israel is showing some restraint, it does have the right to protect its own citizens. And the Palestinians who are being used as human shields by Hamas. And Hamas is paying wages to terrorists if they kill Israeli civilians. And part of this money could come from the EU aid. So it's not being used for peaceful purposes, but for terrorist purposes. Mahmoud Abbas assumes no responsibility, adopts no measures. Is this because he's powerless or he doesn't want to do anything? But we don't know. But this funding from the EU has to be stopped immediately. Tomorrow, bombs may fall on Strasbourg, London, or Paris. And the attacks on the Jewish synagogue in Brussels and the mosque in Brussels are in Paris are an example. And we have to support the Jewish people, and the Palestinians have to be able to have their own country, but right now they have to live in another country, which is called Jordan.
There are several blue cards for you, Mr. de GRAAFF. I will take 2 of them. Mr. de GRAAFF, are you willing to answer them? Okay, the first one was Mr. Emmanouil GLEZOS. 30 seconds, please.
Δεν υπάρχει καμιά αμφιβολία ότι πρέπει να καταδικαστεί η βία.
There is no doubt whatsoever. We can only condemn violence wherever it occurs. We should ask ourselves what the cause is. What should we do about this?
Mr. de GRAAFF, you have to put on the microphone, and please, can you stand up, please? Okay, so please use your neighbors.
Perhaps you can do it
No,
from there?
it's working. It's working now.
Oh, okay, fine. Well, my answer is the following. The Palestinians, as we know them, they should just return to a country which gives them this sovereignty, and that is what the country we know as Jordan. And as for the violence, we see that we have to do with a terrorist organization which is racist, which is anti-Semitic, and which is actually alive for just one purpose, and that is to destroy all Jews in the Middle East. So that's my answer.
Second blue card from Jordi Sebastian. Are you willing to take it as well? Mr. de GRAAFF, there's a second blue card for you. Mr. Sebastian.
Señor de GRAAFF, ha hablado usted de...
Mr. de GRAAFF, you talked about containing the Israeli state. Well, having said that, when it's children in the Gaza Strip who are dying from Israeli bombs, you can't blame Hamas for that.
Yes, you are absolutely right. There are children at stake at this moment, and what we see is that these ruthless murderers are using even children as a defense against the people which they are attacking. So they are not only attacking Israel and the Jewish population, but they are also actually putting their own people at risk and prepared to have their own children killed.
All right,
it's a war crime.
Continue. Thank you. I will continue with, after this round of speakers for the different groups, with speakers also from around the House. The first one on the list is Mr. Pier Antonio Panzeri.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, Madam President. There's a clear risk that the conflict may degenerate, with all the consequences that would have in terms of loss of human life and a further stage in the actual conflict taking place. We must take due stock of new events today. The further this goes, the harder it's going to be to keep the situation under control, if that's an appropriate expression. The changes underway in the representative nature of power in the Gaza Strip, with jihadist groups coming in, ought to give Israel pause for thought and ensure that Europe acts more decisively. First of all, there has to be an immediate ceasefire with peace negotiations in the very near future. We need more courage. We need to acknowledge some of the mistakes committed by Israel, failing to acknowledge the closer relationship between Fatah and Hamas, with the settlements compounding the problem. Europe, if it wants to increase the role it plays, means that we have to be amongst the top funders of the Palestinian Authority. We are the largest market for Israel. We need to use these tools to force them to the negotiating table. That's our job. Let's not leave it up to the United States to oversee negotiations that we should be bringing about ourselves, because we are in a position to do so. That is the qualitative leap that Europe must make. We need action more than words.
Mr. Panzeri, there has been a blue card for you. Will you take it? Signore Panzeri, il y a un blue card para usted. ¿Sí? ¿Lo acepta?
Yes.
Mr. Jurek.
Pani Przewodnicząca, drogi kolego, czy zgodzi się Pan, że najbardziej...
Thank you very much indeed. Hamas has rejected peace. That's not new. It rejects the existence of the state of Israel, and currently it's Hamas that's rejected the Egyptian brokered ceasefire.
Mr. Panzeri.
Per la verità non ho capito bene la domanda.
I'm not sure I've quite grasped the question, but the basic issue is that in foreign policy too, you shouldn't refuse possibilities. Using the fact that Hamas and Fatah are working more closely together has put Israel in a more difficult position than in the past. So perhaps some more thought is required regarding the mistakes that they've committed.
Now the next speaker is Mr. Geoffrey VAN ORDEN.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Well, we can all stand here wringing our hands, and the fact is that resolutions from this Parliament aren't going to make any difference. Probably the only area where the EU can have any influence is on the use of money, and that's what I want to come back to as well, because some 5.6 billion has been spent by the EU on support to the Palestinians over the last 20 years. And I want to know what leverage the European Union has exerted over the Palestinians to bring them to the conference table for that money. What return has there been what political return on this investment? We continue to pour money into the Palestinian areas with little input on the political situation. The Court of Auditors found that there were people in Gaza being paid from EU funds that weren't even working. I don't want to reduce this whole tragic and serious matter to one of pounds, shillings and pence, but it is the area that is very important, and I hope the next European Commission will exercise proper control over EU money. make sure that it's well spent and doesn't help to fund terrorism.
The next speaker is Madame Frédérique Ries.
Merci Madame la Présidente et félicitations.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and congratulations. We've been hearing all sorts of things, truths, half-truths, counter-truths, and plenty of lies over the last 10 days. We've just heard one. There's only one thing that counts, and that's to stop the bloodshed in the region, to bring the parties back to the negotiating table without the rockets, as you said, Minister. A total end to the hostilities by Israel, by Mahmoud Abbas, rejected by Hamas. Hamas has rejected the ceasefire in order to continue the struggle. In Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, all over Israel. That's the reality they're living. No government in the world would tolerate that without reacting. Not Berlin, Rome, Madrid, no government. The fate of Gaza is tragic. It's at the mercy of a terrorist organization bent on destroying the Jewish state. It's a tragedy for every man, woman and child there. Every death is a tragedy. Hamas is calling on people to stay to serve as human shields. The government must take its share of the responsibility. It's just managing the conflict without having a proper strategy, but it's Hamas that's assassinating people. This is a tragedy. It's a tragedy that we thought we'd never see in Europe, and we have to deal with this. For the first time in decades, Europe is seeing pogroms. This is what happened in Paris, in Antwerp. These criminals are bringing hatred to our doorsteps, and we have to impose peace. Thank you.
The next speaker is Mr. Neoklis SYLIKIOTIS.
Thank you. Mahatma Gandhi is 17 months old, and Abdullah Ramadan is 5 years old. And so basically there's an endless list of death, children, women, families, the list goes on. And it includes pregnant women too. Many have died, many have gone missing, thousands do not have enough water, and now hospitals are being affected. So what are we waiting for here in the Parliament? In front of our very eyes a war is unfolding. Why is the EU continuing to wait? And, Mrs. Ashton, if we're condemning these attacks by Israel, is nobody listening to the protests? Is nobody listening to the protests in Israel? It's a scandal for the EU and for the world at large to let this kind of thing go on, because we're seeing breaches of international law, and we're seeing this situation continue. So we would call upon the UN to provide international protection to Palestine so that once and for all a stop can be put to this situation. We have to stick to commitments, we have to stick to principles. Israel has announced certain steps and it has to stick to them, because we hear references made to the article that talks about the indivisibility of human rights. We need to have peace for the people of Palestine, for the people of Israel, and for the Middle East as a whole. Freedom for Palestine.
Blue card for you. Mr. SYLIKIOTIS, there's a blue card for you. You accept it?
Yeah.
Mr. Van Orden.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Mr. SYLIKIOTIS, it's a classic tactic of terrorists to target civilians deliberately and to use civilians as human shields. Don't you recognize that Israel suffered 5 days of rocket attacks before she retaliated, that Israel offered a ceasefire, which Hamas refused, that Hamas instructed the people in Gaza not to leave their houses, that during the time that Israel suspended her attacks, during that time 50 rocket attacks were launched from Gaza against Israel. Don't you recognize this?
Mr. Silikiotis for 30 seconds.
Thank you. Obviously, there are victims of the attacks. That's obvious. Every terrorist deed is something that we condemn, but state terrorism is something which leads to the deaths of vulnerable and innocent people.
The next speaker is Madame Margrete AUKEN. The floor is yours for 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Thank you, Madam President. I think it's become clear, now that we've heard several of the speakers, that the joint resolution on the part of the big political groups are quite alarmingly cynical. Because where can you flee to in Gaza? Nowhere. But what you have to ask yourself is, what can the occupying power actually achieve with these massacres and destruction? Do they really think that they can restore the status quo? Because if this is the only promise to the Palestinians, it's impossible. The status quo doesn't exist. The siege of Gaza cannot continue, nor can the occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And a democratic Israel cannot survive as an apartheid state. We have to do more than come up with a useless ceasefire proposal. We have to have an equitable, a just peace being concluded. And we have to try to avoid the two-state solution dying, and only the EU can achieve that. So what we're seeing is that settlements are being built and land being confiscated. We can demand that Israel lives up to its side of the partnership agreement by respecting human rights, in other words, putting a stop to settlements. So the European Union should try to live up to the major honour that's been bestowed upon it with the Nobel Peace Prize, because this is not just a gift, but it is a task. Our credibility is at stake.
Okay, and the next speaker now is Mr. Konstantinos Papadakis for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. The Greek Communist Party vehemently condemns the barbaric criminal attack by the State of Israel on the Palestinian people. The Israeli army has murdered hundreds of people and wounded thousands of civilians. Israel, acting insolently with the support of the United States and the European Union, has been undertaking operations on the ground. The European Parliament, in its resolution, it's quite extraordinary, is playing a primary role in allowing Israelis to shrug off their crimes and putting the Palestinian people and their just struggle in the dock. The various governments are carrying out operations with the Israeli government. The Greek Communist Party wishes to express its solidarity with the Palestinian people and demands that airstrikes against the Palestinian people be ended, as well as operations on the ground. All military operations and military agreements between the New Democracy and PASOK government in Greece with Israel must also be ended. We demand that Israel cease its occupation and that a sovereign, independent Palestinian state be established within the borders of 1967. We demand that the wall separating Israel from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip be brought down, and that all Palestinian political prisoners be released?
There's Mr. Eugen FREUND, and allow me to add one or two personal words. We contested elections together in Austria during the last election campaign. I'm glad to see you here as well, even from different groups, but as a new member of this House. The floor is yours for 1 minute and 30 seconds.
It is a special honor for me to speak here at your presence here in this chair, which I congratulate you for, very much so. We are all very much in favor of a ceasefire, of course. Too much blood has already been spilled. Too many innocent people have died. But a ceasefire is certainly not enough, as we have so often witnessed in the Middle East. I stopped counting the ceasefires that just come and go. We have to put all our emphasis, and when I say we, I mean the European Union, we have to put all our efforts in resolving the conflict. Otherwise, we will only leave yet another generation who does not know anything other than hatred, violence and desperation. It's cruel enough that we rob our young people in Spain and in Italy and in Greece of their hope of the future, as they are not provided with adequate jobs. Now just consider the situation of the youth in the West Bank or in Gaza, living in a stateless entity that is left unable to provide for anything, let alone for a decent living. On the other hand, Israel, as we have seen in the present conflict, is under constant barrage of rocket attacks. This is untenable. In the early 70s, Bruno Kreisky, the preeminent Austrian statesman, was one of the first to recognize the severity of the conflict in the Middle East. He did not find enough allies in helping him resolving the crisis. 40 years later, it is overdue that a reinvigorated and confident European foreign policy steps into that void. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Freund. Mr. Freund, there is a blue card from our fellow countryman, Mr. Rübig. Do you accept it? Herr Rübig.
Recht herzlichen Dank, Frau Präsident Lunacek.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I'd like to thank Mr. Freund for his statement. Wherever there is poverty, there is harsh conflict. Do you think the European Union could do more to eradicate poverty in that region, and what do you think could be done?
Ich glaube, die Armut kann nicht beseitigt werden.
Poverty cannot be eradicated without the conflict being eliminated, so we have to start with preventing the conflict spreading. Obviously, ceasefire is the start, but a ceasefire is only ever a first step. The conflict needs to be ended, and we shouldn't leave it to the Americans. Europe should act with confidence to stop the conflict, and then comes the time to eradicate poverty, because a poor people is a people that has nothing to lose.
Der nächste Sprecher auf meiner Liste ist Herr Arne.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. GERICKE. Madam President, as member for the Family Party of Germany, I'm shocked by the opening statement. Aggressors are being dressed up as victims. People are campaigning for a Palestine that doesn't even exist. Israel has a right to exist morally, has a right to protect its people politically and in international law. It has a right to protect its people from rockets. Israel seeks out the aggressors in a targeted manner, not arbitrarily. The rockets are fired on Jerusalem, Tel Aviv and other cities from heavily built up areas, residential areas in the Gaza Strip. For the first time, long distance rockets have been used. For days, Israelis have been living in fear for their lives and for their children, with the rockets coming in thick and fast. I wonder how Hamas get hold of their weapons. The speaker is cut off by the President. Mr. GERICKE, your time is up, but there's a blue card. Are you prepared to take the blue card?
Madame Eleonora Forenza.
Chiedere al collega.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like him to recognise that Israel has been an occupying power since 1967. They're carrying out collective punishment, which is a violation of human rights. 213 Palestinians have died in recent days, and a fifth of those dead Palestinians are children. Is he aware of that?
Herr Gericke, 30 Sekunden.
You have 30 seconds to answer, Mr. Gericke.
Mir ist durchaus bewusst.
I'm perfectly aware that there are victims, that there are children dying in Palestine, but I don't understand why Israel is being held responsible for everything. There are millions of Palestinians living in camps in Jordan, and nobody's looking after them. Why is Israel criticized? Israel is a model in terms of the way it defends itself, and it is a disgrace to call Israel an aggressor.
The next, Herr TANNOCK, Mr. TANNOCK, the floor is not yours. The next speaker on my list is Mr. Alexander Graf Lambsdorff for 2 minutes.
Ja, vielen Dank, Frau Präsidentin.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam President. Dear colleagues, I would just like to take a step backwards. How did we get to this situation in the first instance? In April, a unity government was formed in Palestine, but the president of that government didn't manage to travel to the Gaza Strip. Abu Mazen was not able to do so. Why? Because he was afraid of Hamas. It doesn't seem to me that there's much government going on or much unity evident, because we didn't see any distance being taken from abduction and murder, and now you see that the perpetrators are being tried in court in Israel. Frédérique RIES has made a valid point about how no country can tolerate the kind of thing that's happening. No country would accept thousands of missiles or rockets being fired into our territory. The Israelis are defending themselves, and they're defending themselves hard. But Hamas is using human shields, and we know that the arms depots are under hospitals and in schools. And it is true that you can actually move about in the Gaza Strip, Mrs. Auken. And then if we look at the situation in relation to the ceasefire, Egypt brokered one, Israel accepted it, but Hamas didn't. Why not? On the contrary, Hamas is saying, no, we're going to step up this fight further. So what on earth is Hamas's aim if it's not terror and the destruction of Israel? Hamas has to accept the ceasefire, but beyond that, at long last, Hamas has to accept the right of Israel to a peaceful existence. Only once that threat has been removed will the Israeli hawks, the hardliners in Israel, accept the arguments, and then hopefully that will bring a peaceful resolution a step closer. Mr. Lambsdorff, there's a blue card for you. Ms. Marisa Matias.
Thank you, Madam President. There are 2 points I'd like to put to Mr. Lambsdorff. First of all, he referred to the fact that 3 young Israelis were kidnapped and murdered by Hamas. No political organisation within Palestinian ranks claimed responsibility for that. The Israeli government has produced no evidence either. So how can he make such an assertion without any evidence and without any political organisation having claimed responsibility? Secondly, what a coincidence that since the Oslo Agreement, every time there's an attempt to reach an agreement on Palestinian territory between various Palestinian organisations, all of a sudden the bombing starts.
Frau Kollegin, danke für die Frage.
Thank you for the question. Look, I didn't say there was proof, but if we're talking about such a terrible murder of 3 teenagers, that an organisation such as Hamas, which actually governs a certain territory, which has got a certain responsibility, would clearly distance itself from that, but it failed to do so. So all I can say is until I hear something along those lines, then I have to presume that Hamas is partially responsible. And I would like there to be peace. The Oslo Agreement was an attempt to achieve it, and we have to continue to work further on that. The resolution is a very modest contribution, it's true, but I think that at the end of the day, Hamas has to acknowledge Israel's right to exist in security.
Now it works. The next speaker now is Madame Sofia Sakorafa.
Ευχαριστώ, κυρία Πρόεδρε. Συζητάμε σήμερα ένα ακόμη ψήφισμα του Ευρωπαϊκού Κοινοβουλίου.
Thank you, Madam President. We're debating a motion for a resolution of the European Parliament today, but I recall our previous resolution that 180 people were killed, with 250 children wounded. Let me remind you what the outcome of hundreds of international resolutions have been since 1967 up until now, that all EU member states have signed up to, and many of them were far tougher vis-à-vis Israel. What has the result been of all these resolutions, colleagues? 2.5 million Palestinians are living in refugee camps. They can't return to their own country, and they're living in unworthy conditions. There are 700 kilometers of walls. 30,000 homes have been destroyed. There are thousands of deaths. There are people living in conditions reminiscent of apartheid. What can we do today, colleagues? Let's not look the other way. Israel is carrying out an occupation. It's not being punished in any way. Now, on behalf of Palestine, I would say that Palestine doesn't need yet another resolution. What we need to do is condemn occupation, the existence of political prisoners, and everything that follows from this. We must use the provisions of existing international conventions and ensure that Israel respects them. The Palestinian people are brave and determined. The speaker has been cut off.
Madame Sakorafa, there's a blue card for you. Are you willing to take it? From Mr. GERICKE.
Ms. Sakorafa, you have been talking about a lot of things that have allegedly been done to the Palestinians. It would be nice if you could draw up a list as to what the Palestinians have done to the Israelis, to realize that we're not talking about measures adopted by aggressors, but that they're protective measures. Perhaps you could draw up such a list.
Σαν Ελληνίδα τώρα θα σας μιλήσω για κατοχή. Αν ξέρατε τι σημαίνει κατοχή.
As a Greek, I can talk about occupation. If you know what occupation is, it's something we experienced. If you had to, you'd know what resistance is. The Palestinian people is fighting for an independent, free country.
Next speaker now is Mr. Jan-Philipp Albrecht. Mr. Jan-Philipp Albrecht for a minute and a half.
Sehr geehrte Frau Präsidentin.
Madam President, colleagues, I think we're not giving this debate the justice it deserves. Perhaps it's because it's asking a bit much to express an opinion in just a minute or two on the conflict in question. It's not the first time we're not doing proper justice to this debate. I've spoken to people in the Palestinian territories and in Israel, and they believe that a simplistic exchange of opinions in this chamber is not doing anything to resolve the conflict. I believe that for both the Palestinians and the Israelis, we're not treating the conflict seriously enough. there aren't just terrorists on either side. And there aren't just people in Israel who want to deprive other people of rights. And I think all of us here need to wake up and understand that the situation is complex. We can see who the parties to the conflict are. We need who the partners have to be in any. We know who the partners have to be in any peace deal.
Thank you, Madam President. We received a number of figures about how many people were killed in Gaza and in Israel over the last few days. And as to how many have died over the last 5 years, over the last 10 years, or even over the last 40 years, and as to how many people have lost their lives and their hopes before a sustainable peace has been achieved, with a two-state solution where two democratic states live side by side, direct peace negotiations have to be resumed. And we have to look at the underlying causes. Extremism has to be tackled, and we have to stop the policy of building settlements. And the EU and its member states have to play a more proactive role politically. This is the most central issue for us, and it's vital for us to show a commitment to it and come up with solutions. We have to do everything that we possibly can. Now, let's do it now. Let's do it together with the UN Security Council and other actors. And everyone who's taken part in this debate shouldn't make allegations. I think that we need to realize that we should see ourselves in others.
Thank you, Ms. Ulfskog. And now the floor is to Mr. Charles Tannock for a minute.
Madam President, Israel is a democratic state, respectful of the rule of law, and of course it wants peace, but it cannot be subject to unremitting rocket attacks on its civilian areas without defending itself and its civilian population, and the right to retaliate militarily against Hamas and Islamic Jihad is its right under international law in Gaza, and it is they who are responsible for this tragedy. And Mrs. Auken, this is compounded by their habit, a war crime, of using innocent Palestinian civilians as human shields and hiding their weapons in mosques and schools. Israel does everything humanly possible to minimize civilian casualties. In contrast, Hamas has total disregard for human life. Even the Palestinian Authority President Abbas has stated as such. And the cruel rejection now by Hamas of the Egyptian ceasefire is a tragedy, both for the Gaza civilian population, who are already undergoing a humanitarian crisis, and of course militarily it's suicidal for Hamas, who we must remember in this House is an EU-banned terrorist organisation.
Mr. Tannock, there is a blue card for you from Ms. Auken. Will you take it? Ms. Auken?
Yeah, just to ask you, do you know the Goldstein report after the Kars-Let war? Because there was clear there's no proof of these allegations of use of human shields. No excuse, no proof of it. It's from Israeli media. And we know that media are very, very controlled in wartime. Secondly, I would just ask you, do you know how Gaza looks? Could you imagine any place to fly to? If you have to fly, this morning they want a hospital, and then an hour later they bombed the hospital.
Well, that's more of a statement, Mrs. Auken. Certainly, Mr. Goldstone, in the end, resiled himself from his own report, if you remember the facts correctly. I obviously cannot say categorically. I can only say what I have read and what I believe is the case, that Hamas has used civilian protected areas to hide its weapons, including hospitals, schools and mosques. And that is what I believe is the case.
The next speaker on my list is now Señora Ángela Vallina. The floor is yours.
Gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President. We, of course, think it is unacceptable for the European Union to see itself as a defender of human rights and justice, and yet has a relationship such as it has with a government which is applying a system of apartheid to the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip. The ruling from the court in The Hague has been there for years, that the illegal occupation continues as unlawful arrest and torture. More than 80% of the casualties are civilians. We think that the solution worked out by the Socialist, EPP, Liberals and Conservatives is a regrettable piece of work, because it makes the victims into the executioners in the first paragraph.
Señora Vallina, hay un blue card para usted.
Ms. Vallina, Mr. Koski has a blue card for you. Do you accept it?
Szanowna Pani,
Madam, the first victim in a war is truth. In this situation, we have unjustified allegations leveled against Israel. Imagine your country being attacked from neighboring territory. How would you behave if there were armed bands across your country's border? Do you agree that having armed bands on your territory is already an act of aggression under international law? Israel has not been found guilty of anything by an international court.
Mire, le voy a recordar la carta.
Look, let me just remind you of the UN founding charter. It says that every occupied people has the right to defend itself. Palestine doesn't have its own army. They have stones. There may be some groups that have weapons, but just remember the UN charter.
La próxima en mi lista es señora Bodil Ceballos.
Tack, fru talman. När man hör
Thank you. Having listened to a lot of the contributions today, you'd get the impression that we are only looking at Palestine and what's happening there, but we have to remember that Israel has got a responsibility to protect the civilian population in the occupied areas. Now here, they are not employing more violence than is required for self-defense purposes. We have to be clear about our stance. Now if you look at the resolution, we are talking about trade, etc., but I mean, we are not really going to get much further on that basis. Israel has to protect all of its citizens. There's a demonstration outside today, and Israeli citizens are taking part in that because they want to show solidarity with the Palestinian state and with the suffering of the Palestinians, and to tell the EU that it's not a good thing to bombard civilians. So you might look at what's being said in the chamber. We're not talking about pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian policies. We're talking about complying with international law and humanitarian law.
Thank you. There's a blue card for you from Mr. Jurek. Do you accept it? Mr. Jurek?
Bardzo dziękuję.
Thank you very much. For the last 66 years, Israel has fought wars as a result of aggression on against its territory or preparation for aggression. Can you deny that?
Ms. Ceballos, for 30 seconds.
I'm glad that I got a blue card to reply to, because we're upset about some of the senseless statements that have been made in the chamber today, and I think that I can share what the Social Democratic colleagues have said. Obviously it's not the case that the 66 years have passed, but I mean, what we're looking at is that we've got an occupying power that's occupying a people.
Okay, now the next speaker on the list is Ana Gomez.
Gaza.
In Gaza, the retaliation from Hamas attacks using disproportionate military force is a violation of international law. It may even make it easier for Hamas to apply pressure. It's residential areas, schools and hospitals that are being hit. This violence against the people of Gaza doesn't serve the security of the Israeli people, nor ensure the future of the Israeli state. Israel has blocked the borders of Gaza, has controlled natural resources, has set up a concentration camp with Hamas as the warder now. Together they're stifling the viability of the state of Palestine and peace in the region. The EU used to promote peace in the days of the Venice Declaration. Now we're paying for the systematic destruction undertaken by Israel. Commercial relations with Israel must be ended right as of now.
Speaker now, Señora Terre Rodríguez Rubio Vázquez.
Gracias, señora Presidente.
Thank you, Madam President. Israel's wall is a violation of international law and the terms of the UN Charter. Thousands of families are unable to live a normal life. The wall is illegal. This isn't something I'm saying. The International Court in The Hague made the point 10 years ago. That ruling is one of the symbols of the impunity the international community allows the State of Israel. This is the umpteenth instance of collective punishment of the people of Palestinians. All the previous similar interventions were only condoned very timidly by this Parliament. At the end of the day, these attacks are unpunished. Even when you have this clash between one of the best equipped armies in the world and a people in what some have called the largest prison in the world, who are completely cut off by land and sea. We need to take up the EU-Mediterranean agreements, which embody human rights in clause 2. And tomorrow we'll be coming out onto the streets and calling on the international community to take action.
Now, the next speaker is Mr. Gilles Pargnot.
La Présidente, chers collègues.
Madam President, colleagues, there are two messages we have to send this afternoon. We have to call for an immediate ceasefire, first of all, because the situation is unacceptable. 200 dead in just a few days in Palestine. Children being killed in a hut on a Gaza beach. We have to be clear with Israel. The Israeli authorities don't want a two-state solution. Mahmoud Abbas has said there's not one too many states in the Middle East, there's one too few. The EU must shoulder its responsibility. The High Representative for Foreign Policy must shoulder responsibility. We are Israel's primary partner. We should not be afraid of acting. We should force Israel to play with cards on the table. We can't tolerate this situation where Israel doesn't want dialogue, doesn't want talks, is worried about recognition of a Palestinian state. We can't have more suffering, more conflict. We cannot be accomplices to this endless despair. We cannot abandon the two-state solution. We should stop being weak. We should not be financing Israeli projects in the occupied territories, for example.
Et maintenant, c'est Monsieur Patrick Le...
And now the next speaker is Mr. Patrick Le Yarrick. Thank you very much, Madam President. Representative of the High Representative, your report was balanced and interesting. As you say, the violence must stop, but nor must we forget that there is an occupying power, the State of Israel, overarmed, and there is an occupied people, the Palestinian people. There is a country that flouts international law daily with impunity. It steals land and houses from a neighboring country. And now It is seeking to deny the Palestinians the right to form their own government. That is the state of Israel. The EU cannot remain silent in the face of these daily crimes in Gaza. You must take initiatives internationally to obtain a ceasefire, an end to the Gaza blockade, and an end to settlements. Use all the tools in your box, including Article 2 of the Association Agreement. End all relations until Israel comes to its senses and respects international law. Heed the call of Mahmoud Abbas and put the Palestinian people under international protection.
The
next speaker is Joseph Weidenholzer. Madam President, we are seeing a tragedy that is unfolding in Gaza, and we're seeing, in average, every couple of years, a repetition of tragic events. And this means that it's clear that we're not managing to get to grips with the root causes of the problem. And it's not possible to give an explanation in 1 minute speaking time. We need to realize that the core of the problem is that we are trying to provide simple explanations. The Palestine-Israeli conflict is one of the biggest conflicts of our time. We're not talking about simply international law related difficulties, but social and economic root causes. Nevertheless, I think that we can sketch out how to solve this quite simply. What Yitzhak Rabin, former Prime Minister of Israel, once said when he reached an agreement with the PLO a few minutes before his murder, when he announced peace in Tel Aviv 20 years ago, he said that the path to peace has to be preferred to the path to war. Now, 27 years ago, this was said by a man who formerly belonged to the military. Thank you, Mr. Weidenholzer.
Before the catch the eye procedure, now is Mr. Afzal Khan.
Madam President, hundreds of angry constituents have contacted me about the killings of innocent people in Gaza. Israel's response has been utterly disproportionate. It is estimated that 1 Israeli and over 200 Palestinians have lost their lives. According to the UN office, 80% of these are civilians. Moreover, more than 100,000 have been asked to leave their homes. We shouldn't accept that all this is Israel's right to self-defense. Collective punishment must end if we do not want extremism to increase. We know from the history that it is the Palestinians that have largely suffered, and that Israel has systematically eaten away at their land, breaking all international norms. Both sides need to understand that there is no military solution. A two-state solution may become redundant if we do not call for an immediate ceasefire and double our efforts to ensure a lasting peace. The EU, the winner of a Nobel Peace Prize, cannot remain a silent observer anymore. It prides itself on championing human rights, and it must therefore lead this peace effort, providing the voice of sanity and hope. Madam President, the 3 Abrahamic faiths have a common saying, wish for others what you wish for yourself. Both sides need to practice this. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I have 4 speakers for the Catch the Eye procedure. The first one is Madame Monika Flašíková-Beňová.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne, Ulrike. Blahoželám.
Thank you very much, Ulrika, and congratulations on your elevation. You and many members are long-standing members of this Parliament, and this is not the first time we've debated Israel and Palestine. The debate is always about those who like to paint Israel as an aggressor, despite the fact that they've never been to the occupied territories. I've been there many, many times. Criticizing Israel, reducing this debate to criticism of Israel is a failure to understand the situation. I'm a pacifist. I'm against any military action. And yet, Israel attacking the Palestinians is not the sole source of the problem. Those who criticize Israel failed to comment on the fact that there are women who are willing to give their lives as suicide bombers attacking Israel.
The next speaker on the Catch the Eye is Mrs. Ines Zuber.
Obrigada, Sr. Presidente.
Thank you, Madam President. In recent days, there have been more than 150 deaths, including children, more than 1,000 people injured, and there's been systematic destruction of Palestinian areas. Over the last 24 hours, 6 UN agencies, including schools and the health centres, were hit by bombs. And as we're sitting here, no doubt more people will be dying. Over the decades, there's been constant taking over of Palestinian land and rights by Israel. It's shameful to suggest that the aggressor is the victim. Trying to be neutral when you have state terrorism on the part of an occupying power is tantamount to being complicit in that occupation.
Thank you. And the last speaker for the Catch the Eye procedure now is Mr. Zoltán Balczó.
Frau Präsidentin, herzlichen Dank für das Wort.
Thank you for giving me the floor. We are looking at how to sort out the conflict. We're seeing that a call is being given to have a ceasefire between the two.
Auch gut so. Wenn aber die Verantwortung der beiden Seiten unterschiedlich ist und wir eine balancierte Entschließung verabschieden wollen, ist eigentlich eine Hypokratie.
Because the UN Secretary General is saying
Folgendes gesagt.
People have been deprived of their freedom and their dignity.
I am sorry, but I have heard that there was no translation.
Could you repeat your speech, please?
Begin from
yes, you can.
Begin?
Please
Thank
do so.
you. Thank you. I hope that there will be translation.
The European Parliament deems it to be its task that it should take part in resolving war-like conflicts. That's a good thing. And trying to have a ceasefire between warring parties is a good thing. But here we have to look at responsibilities and differences in responsibilities. And now if we're talking about adopting a so-called balanced resolution which the majority wants, is hypocritical. The Secretary General of the UN has talked about feeling a sense of responsibility towards the Palestinians who have been deprived of their dignity and their feelings of dignity and freedom and are vulnerable. We have to make it quite clear that what Israel's responsibility is, and if necessary we have to impose sanctions because we have to have an independent Palestinian state. In that case, and in that case alone, we will have peace. Otherwise we will have to try to achieve ceasefires again and again. Thank you.
Now the interpreting worked well. Thank you. And now the last speaker will be on behalf of the Vice President and High Representative, Mr. Benedetto della Vedova.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm grateful to the honourable members for this debate. The point has been made that the situation is serious and complex, and I believe that the debate has borne witness to that. It's also true to say, and again the point was made a little while ago, that this debate does resemble a number of other debates that I've attended here and indeed taken part in when I was an MEP myself. But for that very reason, the issue cannot be overlooked. We need on the contrary, to strengthen our commitment on the part of the European Union in particular, because it's very much in the fundamental interest of the European Union to support peace and democracy, the process heading towards those right across the Middle East. We have to help solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because as long as it is not solved, it will continue to pose a threat to peace on the borders of the European Union. And it may be a contributing cause to events within the European Union. On a number of occasions, it was recalled in an earlier debate, that there was the attack on the Jewish Museum in Brussels, right at the heart of the European Union. Violent episodes in southern Israel and Gaza have shown this is a very unstable region. So we have to work harder to meet the objective. We've seen that there won't be a lasting cessation of violence or lasting peace until such time as the Palestinian people's aspirations to their own state and the sovereignty and the aspirations of the Israelis to security are satisfied by means of a global peace between them, which is negotiated and based on the coexistence of two states. Together with international partners and the neighbours in the region, the European Union will continue to call on Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Abbas to bring an end to the violence, resume negotiations, and apply themselves with fresh determination to solving the conflict. The European Union has as its vocation an important role in this context, and we will continue to play that role in the critical weeks and months to come. Thank you.
Signora Della Vedova. Now I have received 7 motions for resolutions to wind up this debate. The vote will be at 11 tomorrow. The debate on this issue is closed. Und vor der nächsten Debatte eine Ankündigung zu.
I need to make an announcement prior to the next debate. The GUI NGL group has put forward requests for nominations to the committees. This list will be published in the minutes of the sitting, and if between now and the adoption of the minutes there are no objections, these appointments will be deemed adopted. There are other announcements. The Conference of Presidents made proposals for appointments to interparliamentary delegations, and these were adopted. These proposals are available on the website under plenary sitting. The deadline for tabling amendments to these proposals will be tomorrow at 9, so that's when the deadline will expire. The vote will take place at 11 o'clock tomorrow.
The next item on the agenda is the statement by the Vice President of the Commission, High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policies on the crime of aggression. And I will start with giving a floor Mr. Benedetto Della Vedova on behalf of the Vice President, High Representative.
Thank you, Madam President. Honourable members, tomorrow, the 17th of July, we will be celebrating International Justice Day in conjunction with the 16th anniversary of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which was adopted on the 17th of July 1998. The Rome Statute has given the world a means of consolidating its historic commitment to fending off and discouraging the cruelest crimes. Making a reality of this promise of justice towards the victims of the crimes covered by the Rome Statute is a moral imperative, and at the same time an essential contribution to peace, security and well-being in the world. Today, the ICC is the cornerstone on which the whole edifice of international criminal justice is built, and a major tool in forcing those responsible for the most serious crimes with international implications to face their responsibilities. The European Union, as you know, is part of a strong tradition of convinced support for the ICC. We think the international community in the court has a vital instrument to fight impunity and to promote an international order based on the rule of law. The ICC will remain a major priority for the European Union in years to come as well. We therefore greatly welcome today's debate in the plenary on the crime of aggression. The active participation of the European Parliament in this major issue, which is important for human rights and international justice, is crucial. The Rome Statute Review Conference held in Kampala in Uganda on the 31st of May up to the 10th of June 2010, a milestone was achieved which allowed governments, international organizations and representatives of civil society gathered in Kampala to hold an assembly to show their determination to promote the statute and take stock of international criminal justice. But it did more than that. The Kampala Review Conference also marked a significant step forward in the consolidation of the International Criminal Court as an effective tool by means of which the international community can bring to justice those people who bear legal responsibility for the crimes covered by the Rome Statute when national judges are unable or unwilling to prosecute them. The Review Conference adopted important amendments to the Rome Statute, including the definition of the crime of aggression and the conditions under which the International Criminal Court can wield its jurisdiction in this area. The amendment must now be ratified or accepted by the states parties to the Rome Statute, provided that a sufficient number of ratifications are achieved and that the majority of 2/3 of states parties adopt a decision to this effect after the 1st of January 2017, the International Criminal Court will be able to wield its jurisdiction over the crime of aggression. As this Parliament is aware, all EU member states are states parties to the Rome Statute, and some have already ratified the Kampala Amendment on the crime of aggression. In other member states, the ratification process is still in the final stages, or at least at an advanced stage, whereas